And it really is an honour to be back here in New Zealand. I've been visiting for about 5 years now. I think I might be getting an honorary kiwi fruit sometime soon to establish some kind of enduring friendship between the Australians and here the guys from New Zealand. But it's a real joy to be back. Often I'm invited over by friends, actually from a ministry called Thinking Matters, to do conferences about this time each year. And you're actually in for a real treat because in about 3 weeks' time here in Auckland, it's not me. You don't have to deal with the Australian. You get to deal with someone who's a real expert and pleasure to hear from, Dr. Sean McDowell. And so Sean himself, if some of you might have read a book way back in the day called More Than a Carpenter, or maybe Evidence That Demands a Verdict, that was written by Josh McDowell, Sean's father. And Sean grew up in a home then where there was a lot of conversation around God, but himself doubted and had a lot of questions through his teenage and young adult years that he took to his dad, and his dad said, well, check it out for yourself, and encouraged him to see whether or not truth really does stand up under scrutiny. And he's himself become a wonderful Christian speaker. He's got his PhD exploring what happened to the apostles in history. So if you've ever wondered, what happened to all the people who knew Jesus, who preached about Jesus? Did they die? Were they martyred? He wrote a wonderful PhD thesis that's been published now in a book called The Fate of the Apostles. But he speaks on all kinds of subjects from doubt and deconstruction to sexuality and gender to the evidence for the New Testament and different cultural waves. And he's going to be speaking at the Thinking Matters conference here in Auckland in just 3 weeks' time. There's actually come to the Thinking Matters guys. You can go and check that out afterwards up the back. Today, they're actually letting you have the early bird price. It's long gone, but for the upper room crew only, you can get the early bird price by going and seeing Josh up the back there in the grade. Just want to give everyone a wave. Josh, that'd be great. And he can either get you a ticket today, or you can jump online for today only and use the upper room as your discount code to be able to still get a cheap price. But the conference is phenomenal. Friday night a free event, Saturday all day. I've been doing these for many years, and I sit in the front row and learn a ton from the other speakers that come. So there is more that you pack into a day than anything, but just to help you navigate a ton of difficult questions that people are asking in our culture. Really, really worth doing. So I encourage you to get along to that. Well, I'm going to speak to a different question. We're exploring science in the first session. So if anyone stick around for number 2? Any suckers by? Oh, Ted in the middle, yes. We've got another one up the back, so a couple of suckers of punishment. But this is actually the most common question that I experience in Australia. Let's see if we can get this going. I don't know what it's like here in New Zealand, but there is actually a very small band of aggressive anti-Christians. Atheism is not really a big reality in Australia, but apatheism is. It's not so much that people don't believe in God and they hate a religion and they want to get rid of it. It's, for the most part, most people don't see the need for God. They're apathetic towards the God question. And I get it. We have sun-kissed shores in Australia. You here have rich, vast natural beauty. You have Rotorua. You have Lord of the Rings, Hobbiton. So you've got all kinds of cool things here. And it's just a wonderful place to live. The quality of life in our region of the world is so good that it makes many people wonder, what do I have for God? If religion was just this psychological crutch, pie in the sky when you die, a hope for people in the past to get them through the difficulty of life, well, I live in heaven on earth. So what need do we have for anything to do with God and the Christian story? It's a very common perception. And so many of my friends who don't believe in God, it's more that they don't think about the God question. They keep it at arm's length, and no one's ever given them reasons to take it seriously. And I resonate a lot with this experience because that was my own story. I grew up with religious parents. Mum and dad took us along to church when I was a kid. Just got dragged into how many church services right up until I was 9. And we had a big car accident on a family holiday that left my mum with significant brain damage. She headbutted a truck at high speed and hasn't been the same ever since. And that experience made me take a back step to the God question. I didn't understand that if God loves us and has this plan for our life, why he wouldn't intervene to stop something like this from happening. And so I was an average teenage guy, learned to play guitar, bass guitar, played AFL and soccer. I chased girls very unsuccessfully. And I just didn't understand the relevance of the God question. I was very happy just living an everyday life. And it wasn't until I left school and started exploring some deeper questions. All right, well, what uni degree should I study? What career should I be aiming for? What's the purpose of my life? What, when I get to the end of my life and look back, will I say, yep, that's what I should have done? What is that good life vision? That someone encouraged me to actually read whether the Christian story had some answers to life's deepest questions. And it was precisely there in encountering the claims of Jesus and who he was and what he means for our life here that I came to see, no, there are some powerful reasons why you should bother with God. And so whether you're here today and you're just investigating Christianity, you're not sure, maybe someone like my parents did, dragged you along here today, you're like, what do I think about this God and Jesus stuff? Or whether you're regularly interacting as a Christian with apatheists and wondering, man, how do I actually talk about Jesus in a way that interests people? I hope today you'll walk away with at least 3 different ways to do that. 3 reasons why you should bother with God, taken from the claims that Jesus makes in John's gospel. And the first has to do with something that is of profound importance in our culture right now, the search for meaning. In that Jesus offers something than the deepest places of everyone's heart we are all chasing. We live at a time in our culture where our world is a swirl of stories. Literally everyone is trying to tell us how to arrive at this elusive there of happiness or fulfillment or success. It's the Instagram reels, it's the YouTube shorts, it's all of the self-help gurus, it's the financial investors, it's all of the people that are into healthy eating and good care of animals and the environment. Everyone is telling us what a meaningful life looks like. Scientists, socialites, Hollywood, holy people, everyone is spinning this tale. Now, the question is whether we are really happy. That's what's driving the advertising. It's what's driving the sale of these stories. Here's something that can make you happy. And if you're here today and you're not a Christian and you are relatively happy in life, I actually rejoice with you in that. What I don't understand is that if God does exist, why your happiness should mean you turn your back on him. You see, if the Christian story is true and God exists, then everything that we have is a gift from God. Everything comes down from the Father of heavenly lights. Imagine I've got 3 kids, 8, 5, and 3. I feed them, I clothe them, I house them, I love them, I read to them, I play sports with them. Imagine if at 18 years old, they get to the point where they don't need me anymore and they just completely ignore me. They're happy. After all that you've given to them to be able to provide them life, they're like, why bother with dad? And we would look at a kid and say, there's something wrong with your heart. If that's what you think should be the response for all that's been given to you is indifference rather than thanksgiving. Romans 1 actually says this is the diagnosis of a heart that is sick, that we neither glorified God nor gave thanks to him, but instead just started chasing after the created thing rather than the creator. His to be forever praised. Amen. And so if you are happy, I seriously rejoice with those who rejoice. But that happiness should lead to a heart of thanksgiving towards the creator who made this world and your life and everything in it in order for you to be able to experience that happiness. But let me give a note of warning here in this search for meaning, because if happiness is the thing that you're chasing in life, it's more elusive than maybe you expect. Happiness now, in terms of sociological research, is big business. In fact, here I know that your own government has set up 5 major factors that contribute to human happiness or well-being. That is the very thing that determines all of their funding strategies. At least that's what they claim publicly to get re-elected, right? And sociologists and psychologists are looking at how do we measure happiness in the world. For the last 10 or so years, there's been a World Happiness Report that's been done every few years. It catalogs and ranks all of the countries on who is the most happy. Any guesses on the happiest place on earth? Close. Everyone thinks it's Disneyland. Turns out it's not. It's Finland. For the last 3 World Happiness Reports, the Finnish people have come out on top. No one knows why. They certainly don't when they get interviewed. We come in usually about 11 or 12, just FYI, although I'm sure with current situations that might be on the increase. But what psychologists will tell us, and particularly in positive psychology, and all of the journals will say that happiness is a state. It's not a trait. It's a state that's dependent on the circumstances in which you find yourself, which means it is changing and often fleeting. Back in 2017, in a 51-country study of 1.3 million people, it's one of the biggest sociological studies done to date, what was discovered is now the ubiquitous U shape of happiness. Now, let me give some good news and some bad news. If you're sitting in this room and you're a teenager or you're in your early 20s, you are as happy now as you will ever be. Because life is good, you've got friends and opportunity, the world is full of hope and mystery and adventure to be explored. You've very little responsibility and cumbers and burdens on your shoulders. Life is really good. Then you get to your mid-20s, you graduate from university, maybe you find a significant other and everything goes great, and then all of a sudden, children and career and challenge and responsibility and mortgage and pressures and the rat race until finally it bottoms out somewhere in your mid-40s. If you're sitting next to someone in their mid-40s, feel free to just give them a hug right now. Say, I get it. You're loved. I see you. It gets better from here. Because once you've made it in your career, maybe the kids start moving out, maybe the interest rates are at a more sustainable level, you start making some wealth. No one is demanding anything of you, and you start to get to experience and enjoy good things. And maybe you stop caring about what people think, who knows? But for a range of factors, it gets better again until eventually it tapers off with health and memory and capacity and all the rest that goes along with that. In other words, if happiness is what you base your life on, then you're probably in for a rude awakening. If what this state, this fleeting feeling of happiness is what you're chasing, then so much of your life, it's going to feel like an enigma, like it's elusive, that it doesn't provide enough meaning to get you through the difficulties that you will face. And this is precisely the story of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. Let me tell you, if you're a young person here, incline your ear to the wisdom literature in the scriptures. Because in Ecclesiastes, it's an interview between someone like Joe Rogan, the interviewer, and then he's got on a special guest, right? This old wise sage, the teacher, the Qoheleth. It's a Solomon-like, king-like figure. And he's talking to him about the meaning of life. What should we chase? What is the there of happiness, fulfillment, success? And he starts cataloging all of the different means that he pursued to tap real meaning in life. He talks about his pursuit of wealth, how he amassed huge mountains of gold and silver that would combat Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. So much gold that he could swim in it like the old school Disney, Scrooge McDuck kind of style for all of you old timers like me. And yet with all of that money, he said, you know what? It wasn't enough. He starts talking about his sexual exploits, the relationships, the swipe right, swipe left attitude, the hundreds and hundreds of wives and concubines. He said no, never to his feelings and said yes every single time. And yet he said, when it comes to the arms of another person, it's still not enough. He starts describing his work, all of these vast monuments, even an ancient wonder of the world, the great Solomon's temple. These things that would outlast him, that would live on to testify to his memory and his ingenuity and his architecture and his bigness, and yet still, it's not enough. And so he leans into wisdom, the acquisition of practical knowledge, becoming the Tony Robbins of the ancient world so that people would flock to his feet to learn from him as a sage, and yet it's still not enough. He said, if life is only what we can access under the sun, if it's only something in this material world, then ultimately the deepest hungers of our heart go unmet. And he begins to use this Hebrew word hevel some 37 times. In our English Bibles, it's translated meaningless. In the Hebrew, it means a smoke or a vapor. It's something that at a distance, it kind of looks solid, like a column, like you can reach out and grab it, but when you do, it's elusive, like happiness, and it slips through your fingers. And so he says, if this is all that there is, life under the sun, then ultimately everything is meaningless. The great philosopher of our time, Jim Carrey, put it this way. He said, I wish everyone could get rich and famous in everything they ever dreamed of so that they can see it is not the answer. He's repeating here the teaching of Ecclesiastes. Why? Because we are made for something more. You see, every hunger in the human experience, everything that is innate to all of humanity, each one of those points towards the reality of something out beyond ourselves. When we thirst, that points to the reality of water. to be able to satiate our thirst. When you listen to me for too long here and you get hungry, the rumbling down inside, that points towards the reality of food out there to satiate that hunger. From time to time, human beings tend to experience sexual desire, and that points towards the reality in the world of a particular romantic relationship which can satisfy that desire. So then what do we make of this deep, innate hunger in the human heart that finds satisfaction of nothing in this material world? And it's at looking for this search for meaning, this search for deep relationship that C.S. Lewis makes this observation. He says, if I find within myself a desire which nothing in this world can satisfy, the most logical explanation is that I was made for another world. Every human being is created in the image of God for deep and meaningful relationships, to love God with all of our being, heart, soul, mind, and strength. The contours of our humanity are only fulfilled in a relationship with Him, which is why when Jesus stepped onto the stage of planet Earth, in John 5 and 6, He begins to speak of Himself as the bread of life and as living water, as the one who can satisfy the deepest hungers and thirsts of the human heart in a way that no one and nothing else can. Now, in no way does Christianity denigrate desire. Earthly things are good. They're gifts from God to be received with thanksgiving, but they are not enough and never will be. No one and nothing on earth can fill what Blaise Pascal described as the God-shaped hole at the heart of every human being. Or as Augustine of Hippo, the great bishop, said, God, you have made us for yourselves, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. That it's a relationship with Jesus where we come fully alive. And the grand irony in all of this is that Christians, when it comes to the well-being markers, are better off on every single one of them. And most obviously, in happiness. That irrespective of external circumstances and what's happening in a person's life, there is this deep and abiding joy that comes with knowing Jesus, walking with Jesus, having the sure hope in Jesus that can be untouched from all of the suffering and struggle of this life, which is maybe why C.S. Lewis said, if you aim at earth, you miss both heaven and earth. But if you aim at heaven, you get earth thrown in. Jesus offers a satisfaction in life that no one and nothing else can. Reason number one. Reason number two has to speak to the answers to life's deepest questions that all of us are searching for. In the 20th century, there was a famed anthropologist by the name of Loren Eiseley. Yes, it sounds New Zealand, definitely sounds Lord of the Rings, like he's an elf. But this guy was a secular thinker, didn't believe in God, was incredibly well achieved in his field. He earned 36 honorary degrees in his lifetime, which I'm pretty sure is more degrees than you have on your thermometers here. And he made this observation. That's what we call a latent reaction. Just shows me how asleep everyone still is. He made this observation about human nature, and he studied throughout time various human cultures and around the world people today, and he made this observation. He said, man is the cosmic orphan. He is the only creature in the universe who asks, why? Other animals have instincts to guide them, but man has learned to ask questions. Who am I? Man asks. Why am I here? And where am I going? You see, according to this secular thinker, Loren Eiseley, these are the inescapable questions that every generation has to answer. And with so many competing answers in our cultural moment, from religious and secular stories, who do we trust? Because in absence of answers to these questions, we're wandering through the dark. We're stumbling through life, not knowing what should guide us, who we're meant to become, what we're meant to be living for. We make a whole range of mistakes. Now, like I said, I'm the dad of a few kids. We went through a huge phase of sleeplessness where multiple times a night kids would wake up and scream out for your attention. Somehow my wife never woke up. I always tended to wake up. And so I would stumble out of bed, and I don't wake up alert, right? Some people wake up and they can navigate in the dark and they can see. Maybe I didn't eat enough carrots growing up. I don't know what it was, but I just don't get residual light taken in. So I'm stumbling through the darkness, and inevitably I would kick my toe on the corner of the bed. Ow, test my Christianity. Or, you know, the worst one, when a door is ajar and you bump into it on your forehead and it doesn't move because it's perfectly, man. it's hard to navigate life in the dark. And all of a sudden, Jesus turns up, and in John 8:12, he makes the claim, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Jesus said to a world that's stumbling in the dark, unsure how to answer life's deepest questions, "I have come to turn the lights on." And through the Christian story, Jesus offers answers to the richest dimensions of our experience. The explanatory power of the Bible to all of life. Where does the universe come from? Why does it work the way that it does? Where do we come from? Why do we feel and think and act the way that we do? What's wrong with the world? How can it be set right? Is there any hope for humanity after death? All of these questions the Christian story speaks to. As C.S. Lewis, before he became a Christian, was an atheist, and outspokenly so. He was convinced that there was no God because of the same thing I stumbled with, the problem of pain. He said the evil and the suffering, it just doesn't look like a world that a good God would make. But then he began to talk to intelligent Christians. And if you're a newcomer, that is not an oxymoron. Many of the brightest minds throughout history have been themselves believers in God, believers in the Bible, and believers in Jesus. And over time, as he heard their arguments, particularly from J.R.R. Tolkien, another one of his good friends, he began to be persuaded, maybe Christianity is true. Why? Well, because fumbling through life intellectually, he realized that many of the things that he believed actually didn't fit with his atheism. You see, he had this sense that human beings were extraordinary creatures with inalienable dignity, inalienable worth and value. That human beings possess consciousness and rationality and free will. That human beings are driven for deep and meaningful relationships of self-giving love. And he said, which story best makes sense then of this human experience? One where human beings are a cosmic accident with no design and no purpose? Or a story where human beings are made in God's image, the image of a relational God, put here for a reason? He had this sense that our universe had a moral fabric to it. He expresses in his book, Mere Christianity, that some things like oppression or like rape are objectively evil, even if a lot of people think that it's morally okay. It's not just relatively unpopular. This is heinous. So which story makes the most sense of this deep moral feature to our experience? A world where there is no good and no evil, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference, an amoral universe? Or a world where morality is woven into creation itself because it reflects the very nature of God, his wisdom spelled out in the world? And he had this sense from his own brush with war and its horrors, with the death of dear friends, that there was something terribly wrong with this world, that this is not how things should be. But again, what makes sense of this deep intuition? One where this is exactly how things have always been, nature red in tooth and claw. Or one where the world was created for good, but has become fallen, now damaged by evil, that the train of this world is off its tracks. You see, the secular story that he had believed, it tended to flatten or explain away all of these realities as illusory. And what he discovered is that Jesus' story shed light on them in ways that were amazing. That from a study of science, of the heavens above, or of the humanities and our complex experiences, the moral law within, the Christian story made the most sense of the evidence, offering rich answers to life's deepest questions. Who am I as a human being made in God's image? Why am I here? My purpose to love God, love others, and cultivate the planet. And where am I going? Where he shall be, I shall be also. Which is why in one paper he delivered to the Oxford Socratic Club, Is Theology Poetry? He penned these words: I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. That the Christian story enabled him to make sense of reality. It was the sun that dawned that shed light on all of life, not with simplistic answers, but with rich and complex answers that make sense of our complex lives. Psalm 119, 105, that your word is a lamp for my path and a light to my feet. So because of Jesus, I'm not stumbling in the darkness anymore. Because of his story, I know who I am and why I'm here and what life is ultimately about. And following Jesus is that sun that dawns for each one of us, offering answers to life's deepest questions. Number 2. And then number 3, it has something to do with our ultimate human problem. What's been defined as the technical problem to be overcome in the 21st century by technology: death. You see, Jesus offers this transforming hope that no one and nothing else does. No doubt these last few years have hit hard. We've experienced in Australia fires and floods. Here you've had earthquakes, pandemics. We've all seen protests right around the world. We're standing in the shadow of Putin and the potential threats that looms with global war. We've watched over COVID as the death toll ticked up globally. We've become aware of the reality of death in a way that for decades before, we could almost ignore or numb ourselves to it. But at some point, each one of us faces this reality of death. It's a global statistic. 1 out of 1 people will die. So do you think of death? Have you considered what that means for what you do here? Have you been grieved by death, at the loss of someone that you love? A few years back, I was working for an international ministry with some great men and women that I love deeply. One of the guys that I met working together was a guy by the name of Nabil Qureshi. For years we served on a team together. He was an ex-Muslim who converted to Christianity, wrote his story, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, a wonderful biography of how he became convinced to leave Islam because of studying the life of Muhammad, and why he became a Christian because he studied the life of Jesus. He was a New York Times bestseller, was a huge international audience, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views on his videos on YouTube, and at 34 years of age, with a wife and a young daughter, got a diagnosis of cancer. And 9 months later, he was gone. This is the last photo. Oh, sorry, I haven't been clicking this through. This is the last photo that we had together. It was about 2 months before he died. Singing together many of the songs around the victory and the hope of God. But I'll never forget, I was leading worship to see him, hands raised. It is well with my soul. How do we face these moments of tragedy and of loss? If the secular story is true and there is no God, then Nabil is just gone. Death is the dead end, and that's it. The people that we plant in the ground have become fertilizer. Their atoms reconstituted to serve other living organisms. Nothing of them survives, and all of their memory is ultimately washed away within a generation or two. Last year we recorded for Easter a spoken word piece, Is Jesus Alive? And we did it in Toowong Cemetery in Brisbane. With permission, you're standing amongst graves that have so worn down in the messaging, you can't see the names or the dates. Tombs that are cracked and fallen open with the earth movement beneath them. No one's visited them in decades. Is that our destiny? That all of the grand deeds of our life are brought to nothing by time and tragedy. In this moment of transhumanism, where many technological organizations are trying to find ways to defeat death, to reverse the biological clock by genetic engineering, to create silicon-based life forms, we can upload our consciousness into a computer to have eternal life, where women are spending large amounts of money on potions and creams to try and reverse the signs of aging, or the search for the fountain of youth somewhere around the world. Yuval Harari has written a book, Homo Deus, the pursuit of humans becoming gods, by being able to finally overcome this small glitch in our biology, death. Because we realize that it really does grieve us, that death feels wrong. This is not the way that things ought to be. But if the Christian story is true, then death doesn't have to be a dead end. In John chapter 11, Jesus goes to visit 2 grieving sisters, Mary and Martha. They've just lost their brother Lazarus, one of Jesus' dear friends, and he turns up 3 days after Lazarus died. He's been buried now for a long time, so much so that in the KJV, the Bible says his body stinketh. And it's to those two grieving sisters that Jesus describes himself in John 11:25. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he dies, shall live. And these ones who live, believing in me, shall never die. Do you believe this? You see, if Jesus really did rise from the dead, if resurrection really is on the table, and not just resuscitation into the same body with the same rate of decay, but resurrection into bodies that are eternal, that are indestructible, then that radically changes the calculus for how we process this life. That death is not a dead end now, but simply a comma, a pregnant pause. Or in the language of the Apostle Paul, he said, when Christians bury someone, we plant a seed that is perishable, that will one day burst forth imperishable. That graveyards are actually gardens of hope. The belief that one day those people that we've put down there will rise up again victorious and eternal in something far more beautiful than anything we ever put there before. It changes how you live. See, the great catch cry of 7 or 8 years ago was YOLO, remember? You only live once. So go out there and be an idiot. Squeeze as much pleasure juice as you can out of life because this is all that there is. And what Jesus comes along and says, actually, no, it's Yale. You actually live eternally for all those who trust in him. Sounds more intelligent being an Ivy League university. But when you stretch out that vision of what eternal life means, this small, tiny thread of some 20, 40, 60, or 80 years here is but a drop in the bucket compared to the oceans of eternity, which is what catapults Christians into a very different life. We don't have to protect our life as though it's the only one that we have. We can give it freely in self-giving love, sacrificing ourselves for the sake of others, giving ourselves to causes which don't benefit our bank account or international status or even the external experiences of happiness. But we can walk into suffering to join others in it in order to help lift them out, to give them hope. Nothing could be more relevant than Jesus' promise to beat our last and greatest enemy, death. Now you might be thinking, Dan, that's just pie in the sky. It's hope again. But it's a hope that is anchored not simply in our wish fulfillment, that we want it to be true. It's a hope that's anchored in the historical reality that Jesus stood up after being dead. The death tried its best to wipe him out, and 3 days later he rose from the dead and left that grave behind forever. Why trust Jesus in the answers to life's deepest questions? Because he is the last man standing where everyone else has fallen. And if I trust the one who can ultimately defeat death, his whole mission in John's gospel is to offer us life. But there is a reason why humanity dies. And there is a reason why Jesus chose to die. As he turns up on the scene, he describes himself as the great physician of our souls. And his diagnosis is that the heart of our human problem is a problem with our human heart. That everyone in here has a terminal condition. It's called sin. And it's like a cancer that is spread out into all of humanity. It corrupts us and it curves us inwards in selfishness and spiritual sickness. All of us here commit sins of commission, the things that we do that we should not do. And even when we I haven't done anything bad today, you measure yourself up against the life of Jesus and you realize there are sins of omission. Anyone who knows the good that he ought to do and does not do it sins. None of us live up to that bar of what it means to love God and love others with all of our being. And Jesus said that the wages of this sin is death, which is precisely why he took our place on the cross. 2 Corinthians 5:21 describes this beautiful exchange where Jesus offers his perfect life lived before God, a life of love. And instead, through union with us, takes our place and all of our evil, all of our darkness, all of our sin upon himself to be able to stand in that judgment and to take our sentence. He came not to condemn the world, but to save it. And for everyone in here, you're invited to come and see, to read John's gospel for yourself, to ask away with your doubts and your questions, to see whether or not this beautiful life lived before God to reveal who he is and who we should be. That life given for you and for me in order to give us life. A satisfaction that no one and nothing else can answer. This light that helps shed sense on all of reality. And then a hope that is untouched by the suffering, struggle, and death of this world. The death need not spell out the end, but there is life to come. These are three of the reasons why, irrespective of where you come from, I really do think you should bother with God and launch your own investigation as to why Jesus is worth believing. Now, this morning, we're going to have an opportunity now for some Q&A, and I promise I won't keep you too long. I know many people have lunch plans or at least are incredibly bored already, but what I want to do is just give you 30 seconds or 1 minute to process with the person next to you. What's one thing that stood out to you from this morning? And if you can ask a question, not on these subjects, but anything to do with God and suffering and questions of judgment and the Bible and other religions or things in your own story, questions that people have asked you that you don't know how to answer, what's one question that you might like to ask in the Q&A? And then we'll come back and just do 15 minutes together. Thanks so much. It's great to hear lively conversation. Hopefully that means that there's a lot going on in your minds and your hearts. Just a couple of quick things about Q&A, maybe to burst the bubble of your expectations. It's always good to come in with low expectations and be pleasantly surprised rather than go and see a movie, think it's going to be the best movie ever, and then it turns out to be Indiana Jones 4 and it destroys the entire franchise. Luckily, number 5 is great. I can testify. It's really worth seeing. Kind of redeems the whole thing. Good end to Harrison Ford. Wonderful actor. But similar with Q&A, the reason why you're often going to be left disappointed is because many of the questions that you ask require a really long conversation with someone with a lot more expertise than what I possess. I consider myself more a budding GP in this way when it comes to people's questions. I try and know a tiny bit about a lot of things in order to know how to diagnose the question and point you in the right direction. Like with your government welfare and our Medicare, the GP is free, but often you have to pay for the specialist that I point you towards. It might be a book or it might be a course or something that you can go and check out, but I'll try and give you free videos online as well. But the second thing to know is that there's always dimensions to people's questions that I don't know about, that come from our own story and experiences. And even if I had the best EQ in the world, which my wife will testify to the fact that I don't, I still don't have the ability that Jesus has where it says, and Jesus knowing their hearts said. I don't get that supernatural insight. And so if I miss something in your question, please feel free to come and chat to me afterwards. I'll stick around for as long as we can to be as helpful as we can. With all of that said, it'd be great. Maybe chuck up your hand. We'll jump straight to the second question because no one ever likes asking the first one. Yes, we're going to have a mic brought round. Would be great. Maybe just introduce your name.
Yeah, I'm interested in the apathy question, which is no doubt true. And clearly that's about, why do I need God if I'm already happy? I wonder if some of the apathy of our culture is a suspicion that why being happy would I accept a God who might ruin my happiness? This sort of suspicion. And I think it's subconscious, but the suspicion of a God who is not really good. In reality. And do you think it's true? And where does that suspicion come from?
What was your name, sorry?
Johnny.
John. I think that was a great perception, actually. I think there's a lot of truth to that. That maybe the concept that religion is a cosmic killjoy, that God is a moral straitjacket, keeping us from doing all the things that are ultimately fun. And so I think that's something we need to work around, like what is true freedom? I'll talk about that a little bit tonight when we talk about sex, actually, because this is a lot to do with sexual freedom, sexual liberation, sexual revolution stuff. But there's certainly a perception that God is a barrier, a hindrance to your well-being and happiness rather than a help. And so I think part of that, when you dig beneath most people's questions, they're going to be asking one of two things. Is it true? Is God good? So when people ask me about science or about why trust the Bible or these sorts of questions, they're usually asking around, is it true? The vast majority of questions, like with this one, they're asking, is God good? How can I know that? And so diagnosing where a person's question is coming from is key to knowing how to respond. And I think that's largely where these sorts of stories come in. You say, no, I actually think God is really good news for you. If you think he's bad news or a hindrance to you, what is that? Can you talk to me about that? If you knew that Christianity was true, would you want to become a Christian? If not, why not? And so use questions to draw out what perception of God, what stereotype, what Ned Flanders' vision of things have they imbibed that needs to be unwritten by Jesus? And that Jesus is kind of the invisible God made visible. If you want to know what God is like, look at Jesus. And it tends to be that whilst Jesus certainly does confront those who follow him, after all, he calls them to take up a cross. That means one thing in the ancient world, you're going to die. He calls us to self-denial, to self-death, to love others sacrificially. In the other way, he also says to all you who are weary and burdened, come to me and I'll give you rest. And this is the great paradox of Christianity. It's not an opiate for the masses, because if you wanted a religion to make people comfortable, you wouldn't choose Christianity. Jesus challenges you enormously, but the real joy is in knowing God and becoming who you were created to be and living in line with the wisdom of God in the world. And one of the ways I just share this with most of my friends who are just big sporting fans, like soccer and rugby and stuff, is just by saying, imagine if you took all the rules out of the game. There's no boundaries, no lines, no refs, no rules. You can't play. It may be fun for a minute while you run out onto the field, but how do you get good at a game in which there is no way to know what does a good player look like? What is the goal of the game? What are we aiming at? Who's policing this, moving it through? That it's the rules and boundaries and borders that actually make the game worthwhile playing, beautiful and best lived. And that's what we say God reveals to us, the boundaries for life that leads to the greatest meaning and fulfillment here in this life, the wisdom that he's woven into creation. So there's a couple of thoughts, but I think you're very much onto a good observation there. Yeah. Another question? Over here, there's a lady. Maybe just leave your hand up so our mic runner can know where he's going. Thank you. What was your name, ma'am?
Lauren.
Hey, Lauren.
This is probably a specialist question, but if Christianity is kind of fulfills that hope and that meaning, then to me depression is a lack of hope. So why do Christians suffer from depression?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. I think it's a really live one because there's a huge number of people in our world today, increasingly so, who are exhibiting sort of mental health symptoms. So I know there's a lot of people here who are probably wondering an answer to this question. The Christian story certainly is a message of hope. But our ability to imbibe and live into that hope is hugely dependent on the beliefs that we hold in our mind, on the brain chemistry of what's happening, and on the circumstances. The Bible describes real grief. We grieve, but not as those who have no hope. The Bible describes people going through seasons of depression. You think of Elijah, after his greatest spiritual encounter with the prophets of Baal, then goes out into the wilderness, overcome with fear and caught up in dark and depressive and brooding thoughts. And God's response wasn't just to give him an answer, it was to send him some food, to do good care of his whole self. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul describes even of despairing of life itself in 2 Corinthians 1:8. That because of the opposition he was facing in his gospel ministry, he just felt so, I was like, I'm done. This is just too hard. And so in no way does the Bible pretend that we glide through life easily, untouched, either by the fallen afflictions of our own bodies and minds, or by the circumstances of life, which are really difficult to encounter. So this is why in the New Testament we're told to weep with those who weep and to rejoice with those who rejoice. To bear each other's burdens, to be a family, to do the one anothering, to love one another, to encourage one another, to stir one another up, to walk with you, to feed one another. So all of these 100 times that the New Testament encourages us to love one another is reflective of the fact that we still live in a world that is touched by sin here. And so even though there is this profound hope that's real, sometimes our ability to hold on to it or keep it at the forefront of our minds or to let it animate us isn't infallible. And so until Jesus returns and we're delivered from these bodies that fight with temptation and with darkness and our old self and all of the situations, we're always going to have some of these symptoms. It's not full yet. And so for a long time, Christian theologians have described our experience of God now as now and not yet when it comes to God's kingdom. Or the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 13 describes this as though looking through a glass dimly, then face to face. In this life, there will still be degrees of loneliness. And there will still be degrees of depression. There will still be degrees of anxiety. And all of these things are things we bring to Jesus and God's people for help, but knowing that it's only when he returns and the presence of sin is finally done away with and we're delivered from these fallen bodies that we'll be free of all of those things. So there's maybe a couple of thoughts that might contribute to that. Appreciate that question. Yeah. Yes, over here. I don't know where. Oh, he was standing behind the pillar. He just appears. Hey, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Phoebe.
Hey, Phoebe.
And I was just wondering, if God loves everyone and everything, does he love the devil?
That's a very interesting question. Actually, it's the first time I've ever been asked. If you, Phoebe, my encouragement to anyone who wants to get good at working in Q&A space is to go and do kind of high school ministry, because the best questions come from teenagers in my experience. I think God has a love towards all of his creation, but there's always a complexity in love. If God loves, that means that he hates anything which destroys and defaces those whom he loves. And part of what the Bible describes as the nature of the figure we describe as the devil, the Satan, this serpentine kind of figure, a fallen angel, whatever language you want to put around that, is that he is the father of lies, that he is the murderer from the beginning, that he has so become evil in himself that nothing good of his created self remains. And I think this is sort of the end result of sin, the full curving inwards of sin, is he's become so totally evil. I think God's wrath burns against him. God's love expressed in anger towards evil, which is so become his very nature. And this is out of the line that C.S. Lewis talks about of us becoming either heavenly or hellish beings. Is every choice that we make either leans into God's good design, where we become more who we were created to be, or leans into a hellish being going against God's good design, where we become more wearing into our soul a pattern of evil. And God hates evil and yet loves his creation and promises to bring an end to evil, which is why we get the whole gospel of Jesus dealing with the sin in here first before coming to bring judgment to the world out there. So I don't know if I have a total answer to that very intelligent and complex question, but my suspicion is that because of the nature of the evil one becoming so fully embracing of evil itself, that whatever there was to love is gone. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I just like what you said about Christians enjoying pleasure in this world. What's a healthy approach to Christians and pleasure like? Because on one side, sometimes you hear about asceticism, on the other side, you got the problems of hedonism. Where do we strike that balance where we really enjoy, the fruits of our labor, that type of thing?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. And it's probably one where from the outside, I can give principles and can't make applications. That's something that you have to work out, God give you wisdom on the ground. But certainly I think some of the principles that we want to look at are the things that God cares about on display in our life. So when Jesus speaks of giving with our left hand without letting our right hand know what it's doing, is generosity a key feature of the things that we have? Or are we only spending them on ourselves? And so the warning of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Luke 16, is directly lined up with something like that. Is there an obligation on us because of our overflow to help provide for those in need, and who sit at our gates or who we can help? I think that's a good question to be asking. I think there's a question around, are we being ruled by the things that we enjoy? So I will not be mastered by anything or become ruled by anything. Many of the good things that we give ourselves to end up shaping us or becoming addictions. We can't live without them. And so the constant practice of fasting for the Christian was to put these desires in their right place, to practice the ability of the development of self-denial. If you find that you don't have a strong self-will or ability for a self-denial, then you're probably giving in too much to good things, rather than learning to look at that. And I think another way to look at it is, how is it affecting our relationships and our bodies? Either as the temple of God through which we worship him, or the relationship with other people that we have. Are we doing things in such a way that it's neglecting relationships or other obligations that God has given to us? And just a few things that might guide some of the thinking around that. Yeah. And if it's sinful, definitely not. Yeah.
My name's Nettie.
Hey.
My question is around why this God, why this faith? I find that many people don't have an issue with there being a spirituality and there being a spiritual reality, but why this one?
It's a really good question. And on our YouTube channel, which I'll actually show everyone, we've got these cards up the back, just on the table with the books and the flyers for the conference as well. So this is actually the ministry I work with, the mob in Australia, called Questioning Christianity. We have a YouTube channel where we pick up on that specifically. What about other religions? Which is this big question. How do we know that as Christians we've got the right one? Isn't that arrogant or rude or intolerant? The truth is, everyone has claims about spiritual reality. Even the person who wants to say that all religions are the same or that all religions are right is redefining every individual religion to fit that paradigm. Everyone makes claims about spiritual reality, and people have different degrees of certainty with which they make that. What I think is maybe the safest way to go forward is to treat the different religious and secular stories, the different big ideas that people can believe, as hypotheses. If our world is full of data, which hypothesis makes the most sense of all of the data? Which can explain best and account for the universe that we inhabit with its law-like function, how it works, which can explain our human experience, which can account for human history and the different claims that have been made within it, centering around religious figures, and which one of them most animates or has an impact on us as human beings. I think all of these are factors in making that decision. And it's why I'm drawn to Christianity, is that when you look at the competing claims, the vast majority of religious stories don't make historical claims or factual claims about the real world that can be in any way tested or verified. When it comes to the monotheistic religions, they're pretty united in most of the arguments for God's existence. So if I was to do a presentation today, does God exist? The first 5 or 6 out of the 24 arguments I could bring out, a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian could all agree on. Because they all have the same God philosophically, not theologically, not who God is, but what God is in terms of a ultimate explanation for everything, the first cause, the divine being, the source of moral values. We all agree on that concept. It's then who that God has revealed himself to be. Is there evidence that God has reached into the world to make himself known? And I think this is where we look at the need for things like miracles. That if God has nature as a necessary backdrop, this is how the world normally functions. Miracles are the contrast. This is maybe the best thing. If this entire flyer was yellow, both the ink and the writing, you wouldn't be able to read it, right? The only way that you can read the writing is if it contrasts in color or outline to the background behind it. Nature is the background of regularity which God sets, which we can discover through scientific observation, but people generally understand the birds and the bees, right? God's miracles are the text, his special message to us to be able to know who he is and what he wants. And the miracles, I think, when it comes to what can we test or know, are centered around Jesus of Nazareth and his resurrection from the dead. There is more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead than there is for anything else in all of the different religious claims. And so I find the teaching of Jesus and his singular moral caliber, the uniqueness of Jesus, his own resurrection from the dead, to be by far the most persuasive evidential case for who should we trust. And every other religious leader only claims to tell us something about spiritual reality, a prophet or a sage. Jesus claims to be the author of reality. He makes the most outrageous claims, but then provides the strongest evidence to believe them, which is why I'm drawn towards the Christian story. We have a lot more in that video on what about other religions, if you want to check that out. It's 11:22, so I'm thinking we should maybe hit. Who wants to finish? Oh, we got one more up the back. Okay, we'll do one more and then we'll call it quits. I'll set you free.
Hi, my name is Imogen. My question is, how should I pray to God when I am ashamed to face him?
I really appreciate that question. So I didn't catch your name.
Imogen.
Imogen. Really appreciate you asking that question because it's something that I think we've all felt at different points. Shame is a powerful response to looking at the ways that we fall short. And in many ways, shame in our culture has been psychologized as a negative thing because people in a therapeutic culture don't want to feel bad about anything. And so we use ways of convincing ourselves that we shouldn't feel ashamed, that everyone does it, that we shouldn't be worried. I think shame is tapping into a conscience that God has given us to show that we actually haven't lived up to who we were created to be. All of us fall short. Some of our things done in secret are darker than others, but we all carry a story. And what's so amazing is, though, what Jesus does with our shame. There's a powerful story that's told in John 7:53 to 8:11, where a woman who's caught in adultery is dragged out before Jesus publicly. And it's a pretty terrifying thought for the shame that we may feel privately for the things that we've done, then thinking, what if everyone knew? What if here playing behind me all of a sudden on the screens was a litany of the worst things I've ever done in my life and all of you knew? That would be a low moment, a moment full of shame. And this story is horrendous for a number of reasons, particularly the sexism that drives the fact that only the woman caught in adultery was dragged out in front of Jesus rather than the man. But they're trying to catch Jesus out here, and the way that he interacts with her is profound. In the middle of her shame, he says, "He who was without sin cast the first stone." And he bends down and continues writing in the dirt. And it says, from the oldest to the youngest, one by one, they all went away. For the old people in the room here, you're probably far more aware of the ways that your life has fallen short, even of who you wanted to be or the expectations you set for yourself, let alone who God wants us to be. That list gets longer. They recognize that, and then Jesus turns to her when everyone else is left and says, "Does no one condemn you?" "No one, sir." "Then neither do I." See, the Christian story, the Christian gospel is one of profound grace extended to us. That God already knows us to the depths. There isn't a thing that any of us have done that he isn't aware of. And yet, knowing us to the depths, warts and all, he still loves us all the way to the cross. Were you to stand in the presence of Jesus and trust in him, you would experience him wiping away any tears, any guilt, any shame, to be fully embraced. Because that's who he is. That we don't approach him on the basis of what we are. We approach him on the basis of what he is. That he is full of grace. And that because of what Jesus has done on the cross, no one need fear coming before God that they'll be turned away. There's this beautiful verse in Hebrews that describes how we can walk boldly into the throne room of grace. I think about how my kids approach me. I'll be in my office and people might feel, "Oh, I shouldn't knock on Dan's door. I won't annoy him. I won't go in there. I need to book an appointment," or something like that. My kids, in the middle of a live stream, whatever I'm doing, will just walk boldly in, "Dad, I'm hungry." Because they know they're going to find from me nothing but love and grace. That's who God has revealed himself to us to be. And who through Jesus we can enter him with that confidence, knowing that we'll be embraced, loved, forgiven, and all of that shame will be clothed in his righteousness. I really appreciate that question. I hope you look to Jesus and find in him that same grace and love that I've found myself. Guys, it's been so great being able to share with you this morning. I really appreciate you giving me a hearing. Just a couple of quick reminders. I really do want to encourage you, get along to see Sean. I wish I could be here. I think I'm taking my family camping. Otherwise, I almost would have paid for a ticket back to Auckland just to see him. He's phenomenal. You can pick up those tickets today up the back. You can also pick up a copy of this book. Let me just tell you about this for a sec. My friend Rian took me out for wings. Always dangerous when my friends take me out for a meal. I know they want something. So he takes me out for wings. He's like, "Dan, we got to write a book." And there's lots of great books from really good Christian pastors and thinkers that either explain what Christianity is about or which give people answers to many of the doubts and objections that they face, but not usually one that brings those together. And so we wanted to write a very short book that for people who are apprehensive or maybe apathetic, maybe even have skepticism towards God, write a book that explains what Christianity is, Genesis to Revelation, connecting it to those questions. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? What's wrong with the world? How can it be set right? To explain Christianity, to explain what it means in the second part to become a Christian in the modern world, what changes and some practical steps. But the biggest part of the book that most people will get it for is the third part, which is 7 responses to the biggest questions that people ask us for reasons why they don't want to believe or things that they find difficult to trust God in light of. So that might be useful to you. You can pick them up at the back as well. Otherwise, please, we have a ton of free resources on our YouTube channel, Instagram, TikTok, all of the other necessary evils. But the YouTube channel is the primary one. Over 100 videos now, sort of 5 to 10 minute answers to all of the top questions that we get. Stuff that we've been researching and putting together in a really helpful way for years just to be able to present there. So please do grab one of these cards, scan it, subscribe. Hopefully that'll be a real blessing to you. Anyway, thanks so much. See you next time.